Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good evening to everyone. Welcome to another event hosted by Hasim Chani Center for Palestine Studies. Tonight we are going to discuss the topic of the future of the Palestinian resistance after the genocide. And as we know, it's almost 9 months now, or around 9 months since last October. We have the Palestinians in Gaza have been attacked by the Zionist regime. Uh, 40,000, around 40,000 have been killed. That has been accounted for, but according to many experts, there may be thousands more who are under the rubble. Some estimate went all the way to 186,000. So we don't really know the figure, but anyway, it's certainly more than 40,000, and mostly children and many women and children, but also many fighters of the Palestinian resistance. Many fighters of the Palestinian resistance have been killed. Maybe we do not know the numbers, could be in tens of thousands. And we know also that recently Shahid um, Ismaili was also killed, assassinated in Tehran. And the question now is what is going to happen to the resistance, because Hamas is the one that is heading the resistance in Gaza. They are also very influential in the West Bank, and but in the West Bank also there are the resistance that's being attacked by the Zionist regime. Thousands and thousands have been arrested. Almost 1,000, I think, have been killed also in the West Bank. And it seems that the cost to the Palestinian struggle for freedom is very, very, very high indeed. The infrastructure in Gaza has been completely destroyed. So how are the Palestinians going to survive, and how is the Palestinian resistance going to survive after this? Are they going to have enough energy or resources in order to continue the struggle for freedom, justice, and equality in Palestine, to liberate their countries from the colonization by the Zionists? And tonight we hear, Alhamdulillah, tonight we are fortunate to have Muslim Imran again to talk to us. He has appeared a couple of times already in our event, and Muslim Imran is one of the non-resident scholars at the Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies, as well as the CEO of AMEC. And he's now completing, basically finishing up, waiting for the formality of his PhD at University of Malaya in the field of international relations or strategic studies. So, Brother Muslim, can you please explain to us what's going to happen to the Palestinian resistance in the future, considering what we are witnessing now, the terrible destruction that has been brought upon them by the Zionist regime? Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Nazari and the Hashim Sani Center team for having me again. I'm very glad to speak to you and to the followers of Hashim Sani Center. The current situation in Gaza definitely attracts a lot of attention and concern from both friends and foes of the Palestinian struggle. Since the Zionist regime was established in 1948 in Palestine, up until today, the Palestinian people have not faced any more dangerous, onslaught. Although Nakba itself was a disastrous experience, because it was the very beginning of the loss of Palestine and the establishment of the Israeli regime, but the amount of concentrated destruction and killing that Israel is perpetrating now in Gaza is certainly more intense than the Nakba itself. Nakba was committed by Israeli militias across the 27,000 kilometers square of Palestine. They eventually managed to control most of the territories. They drove out about 750,000 Palestinians. But the ongoing Israeli genocide in Gaza and the onslaught on Gaza, and of course the other attacks on the West Bank, on Lebanon and other parts of the region, are definitely more intense than Nakba itself. Gaza is a very small territory of 365 kilometers square, where 2 million Palestinians live. Israel has killed at least 50,000 Palestinians in the span of 10 months. It has injured more than 100,000. It has detained tens of thousands, and it has driven out about 2 million people from their homes. More than 50,000 homes are completely destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of residential units are destroyed. And of course, almost all of Gaza's infrastructure has been shattered by the Israeli attack. So we're talking about a very intense and very difficult moment in the history of the Palestinian people. However, since today's topic is the resistance, in spite of all of these challenges, Israel has never, in its 76 years of history, Israel has never been in a worse position. In the past 7 decades, Israel has always taken initiative, except for very few incidents. Israel has, to a large extent, maintained regional hegemony since the early 1970s, all the way until the start of the Gaza genocide. Israel has managed to maintain regional hegemony through its security and military capabilities, through the initiative it has taken on this front, through the ongoing willingness to use extreme force against its opponents. Israel is one of the very few states in this world that has been striking across the world, from assassinating its foes from Tunisia all the way to Kuala Lumpur. It has been striking capitals of its neighborhood non-stop for the last few decades, bombing Beirut, Damascus, even Tehran very recently. So Israel has tried to maintain regional hegemony. And of course, it's one of the most heavily sophisticated militaries in the region. It spends probably more than any other country in the region on military and military-related technology. It maintains a very large standing army of almost 1 million soldiers, be it in service or reservists, well-trained reservists. It, as I mentioned earlier, takes initiative when it comes to security and military matters. Many countries have built their military strategy and military creed and defense culture on the idea of defense. Israel has built its military and security strategy on ideas of preemptive strike, stand and kill first, as the idea of the Mossad has always been, taking initiative to undermine the enemy by dividing the enemy, by killing the enemy, by committing any practices. And definitely no red lines in the Israeli security mentality have ever existed. Anything for the sake of their own survival and their regime dominance is accepted, including very recently, as we see, practices like rape and other harassments and heinous practices. So Israel is willing to kill, commit genocide, and maybe to the extent of even dropping nuclear bombs if they have to. And we've seen many Israeli MPs and even ministers talking about the use of nukes. So this is Israel. This is the powerful entity that the Palestinians have to deal with. In a settler colonial setup, the Palestinian people, who are just another Middle Eastern community, who are a part of the Arab people who have existed in the region for thousands of years, who are peace-loving, life-loving people, the Palestinian people have to deal with this. They, to a large extent, have been left alone by their neighboring countries to deal with this settler colonial occupation. And when we're talking about revolutions and resistance, in many occasions, there has always been an external lifeline. Even as early as the American Revolution, they had French support. The Algerian Revolution, for instance, recently had Arab support in addition to Soviet Union support. The Vietnamese Viet Cong struggle had external support. In the case of the Palestinian struggle, at certain periods of our modern and contemporary history, it had some direct support from other countries, especially Arab countries. But in more recent years, many of these state actors started to back off and get busy with other affairs. For instance, Egypt withdrew completely from the Arab-Israeli conflict in 1978, 1979 by signing the Camp David Accord, and it ceased to be a rival or an adversary for Israel. Securing Israel's southern borders, making Israel's job of undermining its opponents much easier. Later on, countries like Jordan signed peace treaties with Israel and withdrew from the Arab-Israeli confrontation. Other countries in more recent years, even though they were not directly engaged in military confrontation with Israel, but they started to fall into Israel's regional designs and normalized relations with Israel. And this includes countries like the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Some other countries were on the way to normalize relations with Israel. And in a grand strategy or in a big picture of the region, a country that officially normalized relations with Israel is definitely going to be eliminated from, if we have two columns, is going to be eliminated from the Palestinian column, and it is going to be an added advantage, an added power for the Israeli side. So when we talk about any confrontation between the Palestinian people and the Israeli occupation, we're talking about disadvantageous regional situation. However, the Palestinian people, with the very limited capabilities that they have, managed to persist in their resistance and to exist on their land and to prevent a total loss of the Palestinian land and a total destruction of the Palestinian identity. And this is a very important achievement. Of course, in the perspective of national struggles that succeeded, like the Vietnamese or the Algerian or even the South African, the Palestinians have not been able to achieve what their brethren have achieved in other struggles. But if we compare what's happening in Palestine to what happened in North America or in Australia, we're talking about a successful Palestinian experiment or experience, because we survived. In the case of North America, which is very similar to the case of Palestine, 300, 400 years ago, the European settler colonial communities who moved from Europe to North America managed within the span of few centuries to wipe out the local community in North America. The Red Indians of North America are now something of the past. You find very, very small number of descendants of these original inhabitants of North America. They probably have some museums for them. The languages went extinct, the lifestyle is gone, and even the individuals themselves were wiped out. Millions, if not tens of millions of Red Indians were wiped off the map. In Australia, again, the origins of Australia are another proof of the success of the Palestinians to survive. In Palestine, the Palestinian people, with whatever means they have, managed to survive 76 years of continuous settler colonial occupation that practiced all sorts of policies, starting with ethnic cleansing. The very early days of the Israeli occupation of Palestine was a textbook case of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And this is not the words of Palestinians only. Israeli historians like Ilan Pappé have documented that in books like The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Current prominent American scholars of political science like John Mearsheimer also reiterate that the 1948 occupation of Palestine was a genocidal campaign, and what's happening in Gaza is another genocidal campaign. So the Palestinians managed to survive. How did the Palestinians survive? This brings us to the core topic of today's discussion. One means or way of survival was, of course, maintaining identity through culture, through education, through other means. The Palestinians made sure that the whole world knows about their cause. But the other less highlighted aspect of the Palestinian struggle is the armed resistance of the Palestinian people. Of course, there is civil disobedience and non-armed resistance. It was documented by several, even academic works. But the armed resistance of the Palestinian people is usually ignored by especially mainstream Western scholars and media outlets, because it isn't the the topic that Western countries would like to highlight. Why is that so? Because if it is encouraged, it will definitely give more momentum to the Palestinian struggle and will bring about an end of the Israeli occupation and the Israeli regime. Just like the case of the Algerian, Indonesian, and Vietnamese revolutions against colonizations, the Palestinians have implemented all sorts of military resistance techniques. One can, even claim that the Palestinians had their own, very own theory of military revolution. But it was not, of course, as well crafted and well designed as those of the Viet Cong or the Algerians. But the ongoing developments in Gaza point to our own model, the Palestinian model of military revolution. Of course, relying on tunnels and other instruments. Now, the Palestinian people who started their struggle from the early days of the British mandate, the British colonization of Palestine, have resorted to both diplomatic efforts, to three streams: diplomatic efforts, popular protests, and military resistance. And in the early days of the British colonization, the military resistance was always the last choice. When the Palestinians resorted to diplomatic efforts by forming political parties in the early 1920s, like the Independence Party, the Defense Party, and other political parties, when these parties in the early 20s failed to make an impact, popular protests took place. In years, for instance, like the 1929 Al-Buraq Revolution, massive protests took place. When the British did not heed and did not listen to the Palestinian masses, the third instrument was utilized, which is military resistance. And diplomatic efforts were usually the choice of urban elites in Palestine, but military revolution was mainly a rural initiative. So the revolution of Izz al-Din al-Qassam, the Syrian cleric who moved to Palestine and led Palestinian farmers and Palestinian revolutionaries in the 1930s, took place in the 1936 to 1939. These Palestinian revolutionaries were successful in forcing out most of the British colonial troops from Palestinian territories, to the extent that Britain had to bring up to 100,000 soldiers to crush this revolution in Palestine. In later years, after the Nakba in particular, the Palestinians also again tried the same formula. They tried diplomatic efforts through political organizations. They tried popular and non-violent means, but eventually realized that both didn't work, so they had to resort to military resistance again. In the early 1960s, the Palestinians formed the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was basically a political institution. It demanded independence of Palestine, establishment of Palestinian state. It organized the first Palestine National Congress in Jerusalem, but to no avail. It did not manage to seize Palestinian independence. So it moved to the third approach. The Palestinian community moved to the third approach and military factions started to emerge in the 1960s. In the year 1965, Fatah, which was formed in late 1950s, was one of the earliest Palestinian military factions to revolt. They started attacking Israel, and they engaged together with the Arab armies in the War of Attrition in 1968. They participated in 1973 Arab-Israeli War, and other factions started to emerge in the late 1960s. Groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Marxist-Leninist Palestinian resistance groups was formed by Dr. George Habash. A splinter group like the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine was formed by Jordanian political leader Naif Hawatmeh. And it's interesting, of course, that in the context of Palestine, there are, for instance, Christian Palestinian political leaders or military leaders leading major factions. There are also Jordanian political leaders leading Palestinian resistance groups, which is a reflection of the nature of the Palestinian people being, an Arab nation. Anyway, other groups like the Popular Front General Command emerged around the same period in the late 1960s, and throughout the 1970s and early 80s, these different Palestinian political and military factions staged one of the longest Palestinian revolutions, mainly from the diaspora, striking Israeli targets, mainly military targets, at all possible opportunities. Now, this didn't work, of course. It at least succeeded in maintaining the identity of Palestine as a national struggle, the identity of the Palestinians as a people who would like to go back to their land, and it prevented Israel from finishing off the Palestinian issue once and for all, like what they're doing right now in Gaza. For Israel, the dreams of ethnic cleansing have been very clear from day one. In 1947, David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Israeli militias, who became the first prime minister of Israel, devised a plan called the Dalit Plan, or Plan C or D. This plan was simply committing or perpetrating ethnic cleansing. Kill as many as you can, open so-called humanitarian corridors, let everybody leave. It worked in 1947, when they started in November 1947, all the way until 1949. They successfully managed to drive out 750,000 or 800,000 Palestinians from their homes. It did not work so far in Gaza. They tried very hard to commit such a crime, and of course the Americans came to their help and started to promote and sell the idea of humanitarian corridor, but luckily neither the Palestinians nor the Arab neighbors accepted this American solution, which was basically what Israel wanted from day one. So Israel has always wanted to commit ethnic cleansing. The Palestinians, if their resistance has succeeded in the 1970s and 80s, it succeeded in one thing: preventing Israel from finishing off the Palestinian people and the Palestinian struggle, and in maintaining the Palestinian issue as the most central political issue in the region all the way until today. Of course, in 1987, Palestinians inside Palestine resorted to, again, popular resistance, popular protests and efforts. It did not work. Eventually, it turned into a military revolution from 1988 all the way until the mid-1990s. It was eventually stopped through political efforts, and the Oslo Accord was formed or was signed in 1993. And the Palestinian resistance factions, mainly Fatah, decided to go through a long peace process and a long diplomatic settlement of the Palestinian issue. It did not work. We all can see that. So the Palestinians again resorted to political efforts, then popular efforts, and then military efforts at the hands, since the 1990s all the way until today, at the hands of other factions other than Fatah. Groups like Hamas emerged in the late 80s, Islamic Jihad emerged in the early 80s, became very dominant in military resistance, and they continue to expand their military resistance activities up until today. So this is a very general introduction to how the Palestinian resistance have evolved. Now, second point before moving to the Palestinian resistance after the Gaza genocide. Second point that I want to highlight is who are the Palestinian actors? Who are the resistance? When somebody says Palestinian resistance, who are we talking about? Who are these factions? Now, in general, for the Palestinians, when we say Palestinian resistance groups, what comes to mind is almost every major Palestinian political group. So in the minds of Palestinians, even Fatah, which has resorted to political settlement, is still seen by many Palestinians as a resistance group. But of course, it is seen as a resistance group that has ceased most of its military activities and resorted to diplomatic and political efforts only. And therefore, the mantle of leadership, the chairmanship of Palestinian resistance has definitely shifted from Fatah to other Palestinian factions. Throughout the 70s, even 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, Fatah was always the leader of the Palestinian political struggle and Palestinian military struggle for independence. In the 2000s, Hamas and Fatah were neck to neck. In the late, of course, in the second intifada, Fatah has contributed as much as Hamas in terms of military resistance. The number of attacks on Israel, the number of Palestinian resistance members imprisoned by Israel of both Hamas and Fatah is somehow equal. And that's why many senior leaders of Fatah and Hamas have been detained in the early 2000s. People like Marwan Barghouthi, he was not detained by Israel because of political activities. He was detained because his involvement in military resistance against Israel in the early 2000s. But since the late 2000s, since 2007, all the way until today, Fatah's role diminished completely. Hamas started to take the lead in the military resistance. And this has a lot of reasons. One of them, of course, is the leadership of Fatah. President Mahmoud Abbas has, from day one, since he took leadership of Fatah in 2005, stated very clearly that he's against military resistance. He despises military resistance, and he believes only in diplomatic solutions. This alienated great factions and great members of Fatah itself. And this is why in recent years, we see many youngsters from Fatah, the children of the leaders and members of Fatah, moving either to established political factions, like Islamic Jihad and the other new factions like the Popular Committees and others, or establishing their own new factions, including Lion's Den in Nablus, or the Tulkarm or the Jenin brigades. Many of these people were actually from Fatah, but they are very very alienated and uncomfortable with their political leadership in the person of President Mahmoud Abbas. Now, coming back to who are the factions, the main resistance factions now, if we exclude Fatah, of course, since it has resorted under Mahmoud Abbas to political struggle only, the main resistance factions are, number one, Hamas. Hamas was established in 1987 by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and many senior leaders from the West Bank and Gaza. Its background, its roots go back to the late 70s. Many of the leaders and members of the Muslim Brotherhood chapter in Palestine contributed to the foundation of Hamas. They were, of course, the main force in forming Hamas, but there were others who were not earlier members of the Muslim Brotherhood who formed this new Islamic resistance movement. So Hamas has two elements in its identity. One is the religious ideology. It wants to eventually establish an Islamic state, but that believes in democracy, a democratic Islamic state, according to its charter and political document and other texts. It also is a resistance movement that believes in fighting against imperialist domination, fighting against the Israeli occupation of Palestine, liberating Palestine from the river to the sea, and of course undermining foreign imperialist domination in the region, in the Middle East and the Muslim world. So these are the two elements in Hamas' name and identity. Since 1987, it has grown rapidly from a small political and resistance group all the way to winning the Palestinian elections in 2006 and forming the government and taking control of the Gaza Strip 2007 and forming a government that abides by the principles of resistance and waging wars against Israel, defending Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and eventually Al-Aqsa floods in 2023. The second major resistance faction in Gaza and the West Bank, but mainly in Gaza, is the Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIG. Of course, Hamas was designated as a terrorist organization by the United States following Israeli designations, and every other military resistance faction was designated as a terrorist organization, which is quite ridiculous that almost every Palestinian faction, every major Palestinian faction is listed as a terrorist organization by the United States. So when the United States talks about being a mediator for peace, it actually brings laughs in the Palestinian context, because everybody knows that America sees all Palestinians are terrorists. So how exactly is going to mediate between them and the Israelis? Anyway, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was formed in the early 1980s, many years before Hamas, because Muslim Brotherhood members and other religious Palestinian community members were dissatisfied by the passive reaction of the Muslim Brotherhood wing in Palestine to Israel's occupation. So the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, in other Arab countries is a reformist movement. In Palestine, since there is occupation, they were expected to resist militarily against the Israeli occupation. But because the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood of Palestine in the 1970s and 80s decided to lay low when it comes to military resistance and let other Palestinian factions resist militarily, many were dissatisfied, even from its members, and decided to form the Islamic Jihad in 1981. People like Sheikh Abdulaziz Ouda, Dr. Ramadan Shallah, and the late Fathi Shiqaqi formed a new Palestinian resistance faction whose ideology is not very different from Hamas, by the way, but who believes in the priority of military resistance. So for the Islamic Jihad, participating in the political process, in elections, in parliamentary elections, etc., is not a priority. That's why they don't participate in Palestinian legislative elections or other political elections, except for youth elections like student elections and so on. So the second faction is Islamic Jihad. Today, the ones who are fighting the war in Gaza are number one, Hamas, through its military wing called Azdim Qassam Brigades. Number two, Islamic Jihad through its military wing called Sarai al-Quds. And when we talk about these political groups, the group might include hundreds of thousands of members or tens of thousands of members, but it has some sort of a standing army of resistance fighters. So not everybody in Hamas is a member of the Qassam Brigades. Qassam Brigades is an elite within Hamas. In Gaza, the Israeli estimates say that there are about 50,000 fighters, well-trained Qassam fighters. Hamas itself might be in the hundreds of thousands, maybe 250,000 or more. Islamic Jihad is in the tens of thousands. Maybe it has a few thousands. According to Israeli estimates, the number can be 5,000 to 10,000 fighters in Gaza alone. The other factions involved in the military struggle in Gaza today would include the Socialist Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. This was formed by Dr. George Habash in the 1960s, 1967, and it evolved over the years. Many groups split and left Popular Front because of ideology mainly. So the Popular Front General Command is also fighting in Gaza. It is one of the major political factions based in Damascus, its leaders, but it has a military wing in Gaza. The Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine also has a political presence in the PLO and a military faction in Gaza called Umar al-Qasim Brigades. The Popular Front itself that I have just mentioned has the Kataib Abu Ali Mustafa Brigades, a military wing that is fighting in Gaza. And there are new military groups and political groups that have originated in Fatah, but over the 1990s and 2000s found their way out of Fatah. And this includes groups like the Popular Committees, whose military brigade is Nasr Salah ad-Din Brigade, and a few other groups like Jaish al-Islam and others. So when we talk about the Palestinian resistance, political resistance, the front is very wide. The spectrum is very, very wide. Even Fatah can be included in the political Palestinian political resistance front. But when we talk about military resistance, the main actor is definitely Qassam Brigades, which is the military wing of Hamas, and along with groups like Sarai al-Quds of Islamic Jihad, Umar al-Qasim of the Democratic Front, Abu Ali Mustafa brigades of the Popular Front, the Nasser Salahuddin brigades of the Popular Committees, and a few other factions. So all the way until 2023, Hamas, being the administration in Gaza since 2007, has created an environment conducive of resistance. Meaning to say, they have facilitated for every Palestinian faction to set up its own military wing, to train its members. The government in Gaza has provided them training venues. It has provided them facilities, logistics. Hamas itself, through its military wing, Qassam brigades, provided them training, weapons, financing, experience, technology transfer, and of course, through its sophisticated network of tunnels under the Gaza Strip, it has provided them strategic help throughout the 17 years before Al-Aqsa flood, or the 16 years before Al-Aqsa flood operation. Now, when Al-Aqsa flood operation took place, of course, the situation has shifted completely, and this brings us to the third section of my presentation tonight. An observer of the situation in Gaza can read it in different ways. Those who observe the military and geopolitical development can point to the clear strategy that Hamas leadership has put in motion since it came to power in 2006. It was very clear to those who observe the military development in Gaza that Hamas was more interested in building a power base in Gaza to facilitate the liberation of Palestine, rather than being involved in the political process in order to have its share of the political cake, or to have its share in the government, to participate in parliamentary elections, etc. Of course, different observers read it differently. Many people thought that the participation of Hamas in the elections in 2006 was one way to moderate its political position and its ideology. And many proponents of the participation of Hamas in elections in 2006 believed in this. In fact, the United States itself thought that by encouraging Hamas to participate in the legislative elections in 2006, the movement would moderate its tone towards Israel, probably put down arms and focus on governing the Palestinian territories in Gaza and the West Bank. But Hamas, being a social movement with a very strong ideology, managed to maintain its core struggle, its core goal, its main goal, which is the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. So its involvement in the political process helped it to build more capabilities and to improve its power base, rather than moderated its ultimate goal of liberating Palestine. That's why throughout the years, when there was any compromise or trade-off between maintaining governance of Gaza or playing a major political role in the Palestinian political arena and international platforms on one side, and building military capabilities for resistance on the other side, Hamas has always abandoned the first for the second. For instance, in 2011, Hamas accepted to the National Reconciliation Pact, which would lead to losing government in Gaza, even though Hamas won the elections in 2006. In 2014, the late Ismail Haniyeh resigned as prime minister and signed the Gaza declaration in his house in Gaza, in which governance was handed over to President Mahmoud Abbas and for a unity government in return for maintaining Palestinian resistance in Gaza. And over the years, Hamas was open to any reconciliation pact with Fatah, because if you look at it from outside, logically speaking, Hamas won the elections in 2006, and there was no reason for it to give up any sort of political power, especially that it is still popular amongst the Palestinians. But in the mind of Hamas strategists, it was always not the priority. Government is not the priority as long as there is an ongoing occupation. The priority should be for liberating Palestine. And Gaza was built this way. The government in Gaza and the Hamas leadership in Gaza started to build up resistance power in Gaza. They were unable to succeed the same way in the West Bank, because in the case of the West Bank, since 2007, the Palestinian Authority security forces were trained by American generals, people like General Dayton and others, to see any sort of resistance to the Israeli occupation as a threat. So Fatah political administration in the West Bank, unfortunately, turned into a repressive tool used by Israel and the United States against the Palestinian resistance. That's why raising Hamas flag in the West Bank, especially in the early years, 2007 all the way until 2012, raising Hamas flag or having a small demonstration related to Hamas was actually very risky, because people would end up in either Israeli or Palestinian Authority jails. Some people were killed in custody in the Palestinian Authority prisons. The Palestinian administration perceived Hamas as the main threat. But in Gaza, the power base continued to be advanced. Now, the 2011-2012 Arab Spring caused some sort of illusion, I would say, for some in Hamas. They thought that with the change in the regional order, the coming of many reformist-minded groups, maybe the resistance would have a better position and a more advantage. But eventually, the Arab Spring itself failed, and Hamas realized that it has, instead of gaining more friends, it has lost some of its traditional friends. And if we go back to the point I have just mentioned about the ultimate goal of liberating Palestine and building a power base to liberate Palestine through military struggle, losing old friends who were confrontational to Israel and to the American hegemony in the Middle East was, of course, a very costly move. And the new friends that they gained in countries ruled by Muslim Brotherhood and other Arab Spring groups did not position themselves in a very direct confrontation with Israel or the United States. So eventually you lost some secure anti-imperialist friends like Syria and Iran, and you gained a shaky friend in countries like Egypt or Tunisia or other countries. Eventually, the Arab Spring was a very short episode, and of course, the Muslim Brotherhood were ousted from power almost everywhere in the Arab Spring countries. And Hamas, especially through its renewal of leadership, it's one of the few Palestinian factions which maintains a renewal of leadership and elections every 4 years. Hamas was able to readjust, recalibrate its foreign policy, and eventually in 2017, or even before that, they resumed a direct, strong relation with Iran. They never, of course, cut their relations with Hezbollah, but eventually they even resumed their relations with Syria in the post-COVID period. And along the way, they built relations with Ansarullah of Yemen and other resistance factions in Iraq and elsewhere. So when Al-Aqsa flood operation took place, I would claim that the Palestinian resistance was in the best position throughout its 3 decades or 4 decades of history. Talking, of course, particularly about resistance factions in Gaza. Hamas and the Al-Qassam brigades were prepared for Al-Aqsa flood. But of course, whatever calculations they have had, Israel's approach of engaging in genocide was definitely beyond a proportional response, was beyond the imagination of anybody, its friends or foes. Now, what happened on October the 7th, in simple words, is a very well orchestrated military operation in the envelope of Gaza. The military sites surrounding Gaza, around 11 of them, I think, which eventually collapsed within few hours. Israel's southern command of about 15,000 soldiers, which has been entrusted by the Israeli government to handle Gaza, to besiege Gaza for all the past years, which knows almost every street or every corner in Gaza, was unable to stand in the face of about 1,500 Palestinian fighters who were well trained for this moment. Hamas military group, Al-Qassam Brigades, was very clearly successful in strategic maneuvering. Israel was not able to predict this attack and was not able to deal with it immediately. And it was one of the most disastrous moments in the history of the Israeli regime, because for Israel, the military is not another institution. And this is also another aspect of the success of the Palestinian resistance. The Israeli military is not another important national institution in Israel. It is the Israeli institution. It is the national institution. You see, in some countries, the economy is number one. In some countries, the military is number one. In some countries, I know some Asian countries, tourism is everything, is the main institution in the country. In Israel, the military is the state. Almost every major Israeli leader has come from the army. Israel's technologies are completely reliant on the army or the army trainees. Israel's main production and exports are military exports and security technology. Israel's society was formed through kibbutzes, agricultural communities, and military training and military service. Almost everybody in Israel knows how to use arms and is a reservist in the army. So when the resistance attacked the army and completely compromised one of its most important units, the Gaza Command, it has caused irreparable damage for the Israeli society and the Israeli state. All what Israel has been doing since then could not, until today, cover the fact that Israel's failure on October 7th, the military's failure, was disastrous, and Israel is not safe anymore. They had the idea of building a nation as a safe haven for Zionists, or as they claim, for the Jews of the world, which will be protected by this army, this superior so-called invincible army. Suddenly, the army collapsed by a very small, ill-armed, ill-trained group. Imagine if this army goes to war with a bigger group like Hezbollah, or to a war with an ideologically driven nation like Iran or others. Israel is in big trouble. Now, October 7th was a disaster by itself. The post-October 7th situation was a bigger disaster. For the last 10 months, the Israeli military, which stormed into Gaza in the hundreds of thousands, its best trained, elite units like the Nahal, the Golani, the Giv'ati, and others, were shattered in the streets of Gaza. They had very limited intelligence to rely on in the first place. The administration in Gaza was successful in securing its strategic environment. And once they entered Gaza, they found themselves failing to seize control of any, basically, territory or neighborhood. The only way for them was to completely carpet bomb and destroy neighborhoods, to come in and create a camp. But even when they did so, they couldn't control underground. Palestinian fighters were still able to come from within the Israeli military camps in the middle of Gaza. So it was a military disaster since October the 7th. Now, when you fail to achieve this, and for many months you have bragged about how powerful you are and how you're going to finish Hamas, how you're going to destroy the administration in Gaza, how you're going to install a new government in Gaza, how you're going to force the Palestinian people out of Gaza, and Israel, after all, is a Jewish democracy. It's a democracy for the Jewish people, not for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, but for the Jewish people, it's a democracy. Israeli citizens are demanding answers from their leadership. So Netanyahu's government now resorts to easy victories. which are strategically meaningless in a very sophisticated and long-term struggle like this, they resorted to assassinations. They thought that by eliminating people like Ismail Haniyeh, Saleh al-Aruri, and other senior leaders, they can persuade the Israeli public that they are doing something. But killing Haniyeh in a very rigorous and resilient movement like Hamas isn't going to change much. And we saw that Hamas Shura Council responded by electing another prominent leader who is not even in the diaspora, who is inside Gaza. So it was a message to Israel in many ways, a very loud message that you are chasing Hamas leaders in the diaspora. Okay, Hamas is going to choose one of its leaders under your in a territory under your control, where your tanks can move freely to lead the movement. So they elected Yahya Sinwar, who is, at least by Israeli media, is seen as the man behind October the 7th operation. Now, what's next for the Palestinian resistance? I believe that the cumulative success of the Palestinian resistance, especially in building the momentum of military resistance in Gaza and across the region, and I'll touch on this a little bit now, and the success to build momentum for the Palestinian issue in the hearts and minds of everyone across the globe, including in Western societies, in the American society itself and elsewhere. These two important successes will bring about a decline for Israel. Now, Israel is a unique experiment in contemporary and modern history. That's why the decline and collapse of Israel is probably going to be a unique experience by itself. We all know of other colonial experiments like the French in Algeria or the American in Vietnam or the American in Afghanistan, how they packed and left. We also know of a different experience of the colonization of South Africa by the Afrikaners and the apartheid regime, which eventually ended in the collapse of the apartheid regime and the African majority absorbing this small minority into a bigger South Africa. Now, Israel itself, I believe, is going to be a very unique experience by itself. It has resorted for survival. It has resorted to genocide, committing the most abhorrent attacks in modern history, killing, for instance, more journalists in 10 months than any other conflict or than all conflicts combined in the 21st century, killing more than 10,000 children in the span of 10 months, probably 15,000 children, maiming tens of thousands of children, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and destroying almost everything in Gaza. This did not stop the Palestinian resistance. It, in fact, ignited the region. But at the same time, it has created an unforgettable pain in the hearts of every Palestinian, of every Arab, of every Muslim, of every free person who is watching what's happening in Gaza. People now cannot unsee what they have seen, especially with the technology that we have, social media and so on. The children who are being smashed under Israel's bombs, which we see almost every day, the violations of all human rights, the violations of the sanctity of even holy places, the destruction of most churches and so on cannot be erased from the minds of our generation. So how would Israel end? I leave it to the audience to imagine. Now, finally, how this Al-Aqsa flood operation and the 10 months of resistance, and it's important to note that although they destroyed many buildings in Gaza, the Palestinian resistance did not raise the white flag. The Palestinian resistance, as we speak, until today, is still releasing videos of how its fighters are coming after the Israeli military in Gaza. So Israel is unable to claim victory. They haven't claimed victory until today. With this happening, the Palestinians fighting, they managed to ignite a regional struggle, and that's very, very important. We know the dynamics of the global geopolitics. Now, there is a declining unilateral world order, which was maintained by the United States since the collapse of the Soviet Union. No, Soviet Union and the US had the bipolarity. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the Eastern camp collapsed, the United States enjoined a very uncommon period in modern history of unilateral hegemony from the 1990s all the way until the late 2017, 2018, around this period. Now we're seeing a rise in the multipolarity, China rising, Russia rising, BRICS countries emerging, and America's hegemony in regions like the Middle East declining, America's hegemony in Europe declining with the Ukraine war, America's hegemony in other regions like South East Asia and the Asia Pacific also being challenged by other parties. In the Middle East particularly, Israel has always represented the epitome of American hegemony. So when October the 7th attack happened, not only Tel Aviv and the regime in Tel Aviv panicked, but also the American administration panicked. They sent in warships. They flew all their leaders, the president, all the way to ministers and other officials to Tel Aviv to meet with the Israelis, to lead the war cabinet in Tel Aviv. What was the message they were telling the world? That you are challenging our hegemony in the region, and that is actually happening. So the resistance in Palestine managed to shake Israel. Now the persistence and the steadfastness of the Palestinians for the last 10 months managed to ignite the whole region. We are talking now about almost everybody. Never happened in the history of Israel. For the last, okay, I conclude with this. For the last 7 decades, Israel has always taken initiative, except for very, very few exceptions, like the 1973 Arab-Israeli war. Israel has always taken initiative when it comes to military and security matters. It has always maintained a hegemonic order. It has always shaped the region, even politically, through the moderate camp in certain period, through the Abrahamic Accords, through the Oslo Accord, etc. But now, even small military groups in Iraq are launching rockets and drones on Israel. Hezbollah in Lebanon is challenging Israel seriously, is putting up a real tough front for Israel even before a full-fledged war. Ansarullah of Yemen have completely closed down Israel's southern border, and the Eilat port is bankrupt. It declared bankruptcy. Israel's airport, for instance, now waiting the Iranian response or retaliation to the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran. Israel's airport is almost a ghost city. Airlines are closing, foreign diplomats are leaving the country, zero tourism, the economy is collapsing, technologies are good for nothing when you are unable to run the country properly. Even the other day, I was surprised to read the news. Some Bahraini group actually launched drones on Israel. So deterrence is no more. Israel's existence is at the stake now. And of course, this explains why they are committing a genocide now. But even if you are at this, your existence is at the stake as a regime, as a political regime, if you believe in some human values, you might not resort to genocide. You see, the Soviet Union was at the brink of collapse, and it collapsed. It did not start dropping nuclear bombs here and there. Yugoslavia collapsed as a regime, and the Serbs at one point of time committed a genocide against the Bosnians, but they did not commit genocide against other communities, for instance. So you have the two options. When your regime is, the survival of your regime is at the stake, it reflects your values. Apparently, the values that the Zionists believe in are the worst that mankind has ever seen. When they felt challenged, they started committing genocide against children and women and innocents in Gaza. When the Palestinians, in the first place, for the last 100 years, have opened their hearts for the other side to live together in peace, the Palestinians have never closed the doors for an end to the occupation in Palestine and one democratic state. This is something that even the PLO was promoting in the early days. But Israel has always chosen to fight and eliminate its opponents. When the floor was open for two states through the so-called two-state solution, again, Israel was not ready and unable to give the least of concessions to the Palestinians when it had choice, while the Palestinians, of course, had no choice. For the Palestinians, it was death and expulsion, or any political settlement, either one state, two states, or whatever it is. For the Israelis, they have always had choice since day one, since they established their regime in 1948 up until today. Instead of choosing the peaceful means to resolve this conflict, instead of choosing the honorable or human way to coexist in peace, they have always resorted to expansion, violence, and genocide. History will not look kind unto them, but more important than how history would look at them, the people of the region and the world do not look very kindly unto Israelis today. And that's why I said earlier, we don't know how this regime will end. And I don't think it's going to be a very pleasant end. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, it's already 10:36, but I would just I don't want to just let you go off just like that. I will ask you some questions if you don't mind.
Sure, sure.
Of course, the image of Israel now is completely damaged, and I think, as you said, lowest in history of Israel. Certainly in America, I think this is the worst point in the history of Israel when it comes to American perception. We saw Kamala Harris even talking in a completely different from any other potential presidential candidate towards Benjamin Netanyahu recently. And American public support for Palestine is at highest at the moment, right? So we know that in America. In the region, you said it transformed the region, but probably among the Arab public, but not the despotic regimes in the region. Right? So for example, some countries are still maintaining diplomatic relations. Still talking about collaboration with Israel. UAE is reportedly planning for post-genocide Gaza to put their people there. Apparently, Muhammad Dahlan is one of the candidates to represent them there in Gaza to control Gaza. So that's what they have in mind. So in that sense, therefore, the weakness may come from America, but in the region itself, apparently the Arab countries led by despotic regimes are still in control and still interested to control Gaza. So what's going to happen in these Arab countries? That's not my question. What do you think is going to happen? Because the population, the Arabs on the streets, as you said just now, completely pro-Palestine and really transformed in their minds and hearts. But unfortunately, they are controlled by despotic regimes. Secondly, is what's going to happen to the recognized Palestinian Authority recognized by America, of course, may not be recognized by many Palestinians. But what is the future for them? That's number two. What do you think is going to happen to them? Because from what I read, that most Palestinians now have increased their respect and support for Hamas after October 7th. Okay, and lastly is this. Despite you said just now that the popularity of Hamas in the minds and hearts of Palestinian and people around the region, militarily we cannot, even though they are still shooting rockets, but many of the fighters have been killed. I do not know. Nobody knows how many have been killed. Certainly, there must have been damage to the capabilities, right? Because they are not able to freely move up there. on the ground because of the control by Israel. Not completely controlled by Israel, but they must have been weakened. So is there still hope that they will be able to continue to fight in the future? Even though Israel is going to be weakened, we know that American support for Israel is also dodgy now. It's being weakened because the American public is not supporting that anymore. But if within Palestine and within the Arab countries themselves, it's also not very strong, very weak militarily. What's your comment on that?
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Okay, I'll try to remember the questions. Starting with the Arab countries of the Middle East, I think it's very important to acknowledge the fact that most of the countries of the Middle East are artificial states, number one, that are more or less new colonial entities. Looking interesting, I was reading Kwame Nkrumah's book, Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, in which he says that the essential components of new colonialism are, number one, economic exploitation; two, puppet governments and client states; three, military assistance; four, economic aid. And this applies 100% to almost most of the Arab states.
Yeah.
These regimes were designed by colonial powers about 100 years ago in agreements like the Sykes-Picot of 1916, San Remo, the Balfour Declaration, etc. The region was designed by colonial powers, and when the colonial masters who spent decades in these countries left, they did not just hand the keys to the local population and tell them manage yourselves. They designed everything. They designed every brick in the system. They know which buttons to press when they have to press it. They know which individual has more power, which institution has more power, which system works, which system can undermine the independence of these people. So they have designed the system, and that's why it's very easy for them now to, especially in the countries that were not able to revolt against this and become more independent. To a large extent, the colonial powers still know what is the weak spot in every country around Palestine. Countries that got independence in the 60s or 50s, when they built their economies, when they reformed their political institutions, many of them, to a large extent, got some sort of independence. This applies to many countries in Asia now. Countries like China, you cannot say China is the current China is a new colonial regime. It's definitely, even though it's still bound by the international system, which the Americans lead, but it's to a large extent an independent sovereign state, which is trying to play a big role in the international system. But this doesn't apply to the countries of the Middle East. Countries that, for instance, have no water to drink. Some countries in the Middle East are completely reliant on their neighbors in daily supply of food, agricultural produce, and water. These countries will not be able to come to help Palestine or even protect themselves for that sake. You see, this applies to some countries also in Africa, where very simple militias can take over the regime, or a small number of soldiers can actually declare a military coup and take over the whole regime. This applies to most of the neighbors of Palestine. Some of them, yes, have more money than others. They can cover for their weakness with the lavish lifestyle of their leaders or the good salaries they pay their staff, but the system itself is very weak. One embassy or an ambassador in one of these countries actually can decide the course of the foreign policy of the whole country. So this being said, many of the regimes in the region are complicit in what's going on in Gaza. They are not trying to prevent the genocide because they are complicit. They are involved in what's going on. Of course, not the people, the decision makers in the regime. Therefore, if we look at the future of these regimes, I think it's a very bleak future. It's not a very pleasant future. The decision makers in these countries have to think and reflect upon the ongoing situation. We all know what happened to the Shah of Iran, for instance, when his regime was too accommodating to Western imperialist control of the region. the people revolted and completely changed the system and got rid of their Shah, of their king. If the Arab regimes neighboring to Palestine who are helping Israel by providing them food, for instance, when the Houthis, when Ansarullah blocked access to the sea in the south of Israel, some of these Arab countries opened their borders to trucks of food and agricultural supply to come to Israel on daily basis. Some of them opened their borders for energy supplies to come to Israel. I don't think the people of these regions will accept to take it for so long. Maybe the regimes can use whatever financial powers or even security technologies that they have to repress the people, but how long can you achieve that? I doubt that they can achieve it or maintain that for very long. Anyway, so this applies to many Arab countries.
So Muhammad Dalla may have to wait longer in order to go to Gaza.
Of course, many of the, especially Gulf states, are trying to bring about some political arrangements that allow their agents to come in and rule the Palestinians. But as long as the other Palestinian factions, especially Hamas and Islamic Jihad, do not allow it to happen, it will not happen. Because Israel can weaken Hamas military presence as much as it wants, but it cannot undermine its popularity amongst the Palestinians. It cannot undermine its political influence. That is very important, of course. As simple as that. If Israel and a few other Gulf states come up with a political settlement in which a certain political figure who works for these Gulf states comes in as a candidate, presidential candidate, they will lose. So they can destroy Hamas military capabilities, but they cannot undermine its political influence and popularity. But this brings me to the last question. Are they really destroying Hamas military capabilities? That's what Israel would like to wish. According to Israeli observers, Israeli media, Israel has managed to kill about 10 to 15,000 military operatives in Gaza. This is their claim. Of course, I doubt that this is true because we see the images coming out of Gaza. Most of the men being killed in Gaza are civilians. They kill them in mosques, in schools, in shelters, in people playing football, people at the beach. They like have gone on a rampage, mass killing. These are not resistance fighters. It's like when they arrested a few people in Shifa hospital or in the streets of Gaza and claimed that these were the elite Nukhba fighters of Qassam brigades. They just surrendered, took off their shirts and surrendered. This is nonsense. We see what the resistance fighters are doing to the Israeli military. So I doubt the numbers that Israel claims. I don't have a figure, but I think it's way less than what Israel claims. But anyway, a few weeks ago, Qassam Brigades has made a public announcement that in the midst of war, they are rebuilding their military capabilities. They even released some videos of the making of some sniper guns and so on. And they are recruiting thousands of new fighters. So even if Israel managed to eliminate and kill a few thousands, now the spirit of the Palestinian people in Gaza is so high that they can easily recruit another 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. Because you see, the young people in Gaza feel that Israel has destroyed basically everything. You want to go to university? No university. You want to go work in a shopping mall? No shopping mall. You want to go back to school? No school. But at the same time, your resistance fighters with very simple capabilities have brought this monstrous, brutal regime to its knees. Within few hours, 1,000 young fighters wearing slippers managed to take over 11 military sites in Israel. So what other incentive can you have? What other encouragement can you give the Palestinian youngsters? I'm not saying all of this because I'm a fan of war or I'm excited about bloodshed. I'm not. Wallah, honestly, I really don't like bloodshed or war. I despise war. But when it is the only choice that the Palestinian people have to survive.
Okay.
They have no choice but to do it.
Last
Coming-
comment. Yeah, so you're going to something? Continue. I was going to ask your comment on the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah, we touched on the Arab countries, on the resistance. The Palestinian Authority is the other important actor. It is very unfortunate that the Palestinian Authority is not playing the role it should be playing. And I'm talking especially about Fatah as a political movement with a large following in Palestine and a strong international network. Fatah could be playing a major role in achieving liberation of at least the West Bank and Gaza if it maximized its role in this ongoing struggle. But what we see now is a complete silence, especially on the part of the official leadership of Fatah in the name of President Mahmoud Abbas, his deputies and his secretariat and so on. And in a logical situation, when there is genocide taking place in your own land, in your against your own people, you shouldn't sleep at home. You should be traveling every day in one capital. You should be exerting maximum political influence. You should be trying to sponsor your people, provide food, shelter. If you don't want to fight, you don't want to provide weapons to the fighters in Gaza, at least the minimum you can do is to apply some political pressure on your friends and foes. He's not doing 1% of that. So I don't want to use big words and talk about treachery and etc. It's unnecessary. It's counterproductive. But I think President Mahmoud Abbas has a lot of means to help. He has a lot at his disposal. He has not exerted 1% of the pressure and influence that he can, being in the position of the president of the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, and the Palestinian state. I think the Palestinians expect much more from him. And of course, the Palestinian Authority itself was designed by the Oslo Accord architects in a way that would undermine the Palestinian struggle. Everybody now, including Fatah, realizes that the Oslo Accord was a trap. The Palestinians were pushed into that trap because they felt that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s and the fatigue that the national movement has reached, especially the Fatah movement, they felt that they should have a political settlement of any sort. So they accepted anything. This anything was a trap. This was a trap. It provided clean colonialism. It provided Israel the best arrangement where an autonomous administration runs the West Bank. In the case of Gaza, it was removed from Gaza when Hamas took over, but it runs the West Bank. It does not disturb the settlers. There are at least 1 million Israeli settlers, illegal settlers now living in the West Bank. They are well protected by the Palestinian Authority itself. It undermines any resistance against Israel. They detain Palestinian resistance fighters. They spy on them. They harass them. It represses the Palestinians. We all know what happened to the late Nizar Banat, the vocal Palestinian activist who was a parliamentary candidate. He was eliminated because he was very critical of the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. So it's a very unfortunate situation. Now, I don't think that this can be reversed overnight, because this is a system. The Palestinian Authority is a system. But I think the main actor in the Palestinian Authority can actually reverse the situation. Fatah, as a movement, as a national liberation movement, well respected by many Palestinians, has to do soul searching and join the forces of the other Palestinian people to liberate Palestine. And the minimum that the Palestinians can achieve after the momentum that was achieved in the last 10 months is the liberation of the West Bank and Gaza. I'm not saying that this is the ultimate goal. Palestinians want a free Palestine from the river to the sea. But the international community now is recognizing a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. The ICJ is ruling that the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza is illegal. ICC is chasing Israeli leaders. Almost everybody in the world, except Israel, and to a large extent the Zionist American administration, almost everybody else in the world is saying, give them a state. Give the Palestinians a state in the West Bank and Gaza. Fatah is in the best position to work with others to lead this effort, politically and diplomatically. Because after all, they gave up military resistance because of this. They said that we are done with military resistance because we want to do diplomatic and political resistance. Come do it. This is the best time to do it. The first step in doing it is reconciling with other Palestinian factions and taking initiative. Even if they are unhappy with Hamas leadership, they don't like to talk to Hamas, fine. Go do it on your own. Nobody is stopping President Mahmoud Abbas from flying from one capital to another to rally the world against Israel. He's not doing that.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure whether Mahmoud Abbas is free to travel or not because he's under the control of the Israelis. That's another issue. Anyway, okay. Thank you again, Muslim Imran, for sharing your analysis of the situation. It's always a pleasure to listen to you because of your deep study, and I hope the public, our audience, have learned a lot from your explanation just now. Thank you again, Muslim Imran. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi.
Thank you very much, Prof. Alaikum salam.